Hi, I'm Randy Patterson, and this is Psychology Salon, a channel about psychological issues. If you like this kind of thing, click subscribe below. This is a post about diagnostic criteria for Hikikomori, the Japanese term for a type of extreme social withdrawal, usually amongst young adults. The term literally means pulling inward and being confined. Individuals with hikikomori or who identify as hikikomori are typically under or unemployed, spend most of their time isolated at home, and usually depend on family members or government benefits to survive. Their life looks very much like that we associate with agoraphobia in the West, although the focus tends not to be on physical sensations that develop when outside the home. Instead, the concern is usually more about social scrutiny from others. Now, this problem overlaps with some other concerns that have different names in different societies. In the United Kingdom, for some time, there's been a group of people referred to as NEET, not in education, employment, or training. Usually young adults, mostly male, who aren't a part of the education or employment system, and who typically do not want to be. People become NEET for many reasons, and most NEETs probably would not meet any relatively strict definition of hikikomori, although most hikikomori would probably meet the definition of NEETs. In North America, we often speak of failure to launch, young adults stuck at the transition between dependent adolescence and independent adulthood. These individuals are often anxious, sometimes depressed, and typically socially withdrawn. They too are somewhat like hikikomori, although the overlap isn't perfect, and many people who we might think of as having launchpad problems are more active than we think of hikikomori as being. Other terms for this issue include adult entitled dependence and delayed transition to adulthood. One of the problems that researchers have in this field is that the definitions are so vague. Who is hikikomori and who is not? If you don't have a clear boundary, you don't really know whether the population that you're studying is the same as the group someone else is studying down the street or on the other side of the planet. You might discover something relevant to your group that doesn't apply to someone else's definition of the problem. So it's useful to have a clear description of who counts and who doesn't. And that's what much psychiatric diagnosis is for. In physical medicine, diagnosis typically has some link to the cause of a problem or the treatments likely to be effective for that problem. If we say that a person has the mumps, for example, that means they have a variety of symptoms and that they're caused by the mumps virus. In most mental health diagnosis, we're simply classifying based on the symptoms that the individual is exhibiting. When we say that a person has major depressive disorder, for example, all we mean by that is that they have a certain number of symptoms from a list and that they're of certain intensity and duration. It doesn't say anything about why they're depressed, and it tells us nothing about any underlying pathology. It's just a description. Now, that can be useful for research, and sometimes it's useful for getting an initial sense of what might be useful to try in treatment. But we can't really say that a person's symptoms are caused by major depression. It's more that major depression is the symptoms. What causes it? The diagnosis doesn't tell us. In the case of depression, lots of things. The problem with a lot of diagnosis is not that people don't take it seriously. It's that they do. In the mind of the public, these summary labels become real things and seem to have a kind of explanatory power. Why am I like this? Oh, because I have social anxiety disorder. Oh, how do you know you have social anxiety disorder? Because I'm like this. It's a bit circular. And people often take their diagnosis as a reason to do exactly what will make the problem worse. Because I have social anxiety disorder, I will avoid socializing with other people, which is exactly what to do if you want your social anxiety to get worse, not better. So while it's useful to know what we're talking about, there can be some downsides to manufacturing yet another mental disorder. Personally, I have some reservations about the whole process, particularly when it comes to hikikomori. And I think these are pretty broadly shared by the community, and indeed probably by the very people trying to come up with the diagnostic criteria. Do we really want a bunch of people saying, I have to live like a hikikomori because I am hikikomori? We might be cementing in place the very problem we are hoping to dislodge. Anyway, all of that said, let's take a look at the criteria that have been proposed by Cato, Canba, and Teo in their 2020 article in World Psychiatry. Their criteria are remarkably simple, which is a good thing. It's a nice short list of just 3 items. First, marked social isolation in one's home. That seems pretty standard. They further divide this into 3 levels of severity. People who leave their home 2 to 3 days a week are said to have a mild form of hikikomori. Those who leave their home about 1 day a week, or less often, are said to have a moderate form. And those who rarely leave a single room are said to have a severe form. Now, you can tell there's a bit of wiggle room around those, but that isn't too much of a problem. There always is. Psychiatric diagnosis is a matter of coming up with the rough outlines of a problem, not making crystal clear line calls. If a person has a tiny bit more or a tiny bit less of certain symptoms, it usually doesn't make much of a difference in terms of what you actually do in treatment. The second criterion is a duration of continuous social isolation of at least 6 months. Now, this really fits. Lots of people enjoy the odd weekend alone, and difficult times in our lives can cause a kind of short-term withdrawal. But hikikomori and failure to launch more generally is not a short-term problem. I tell clinicians in my courses that no one is going to show up in your office because they started isolating last week. Most often, it will have been years. And I think the developers of these criteria probably thought long and hard about this one, because just about everyone we see has been isolating a lot longer than 6 months. You don't want to include people that obviously do not fit, but you don't want to wait so long before they meet criteria that the problem has to be etched in stone. So 6 months seems like a reasonable choice. They also say that if a person has been isolating between 3 and 6 months, we might call them pre-hikikomori. The third criterion is that there has to be significant functional impairment or distress associated with the social isolation. That sounds simple, but it's actually quite clever. Distress is obvious. If you're living a life that's really bothering you, that's a problem. So that counts. But some hikikomori have been so successful at avoiding the things that make them anxious that they're actually quite calm and comfortable. As external observers, we might think they shouldn't be. They're missing out on most of life, and there's generally a time limit on the hermit life. Sooner or later, parents aren't going to be able to provide that support. And the longer the isolation goes on, the harder it is to get out of. Personally, I kind of hope for distress in the Hikikomori I see. If they're fine with it, where's the motivation for change? I think it's not a good sign for therapy. But the other side of this is functional impairment. This means that whether the person likes it or not, the lifestyle is having a negative impact on their ability to function. So that's something that can be evaluated from the outside. But it's tricky because there's the risk of simply imposing our own views on someone else. Like, I think people should be out hiking in the mountains. So if you're not doing that, you're impaired. Well, not everyone agrees. That people feel differently about that. But if a person isn't able to sustain human relationships and isn't able to support themselves through work or involvement of some kind, and if they're living the life of what we used to think of as a medical invalid, I think it's fair to suggest that that counts as functional impairment. So, 3 criteria in all. Obviously, this doesn't cover all the characteristics of Hikikomori, and it certainly doesn't include all of the broader group that we might call NEET, or failure to launch, or delayed transition to adulthood. Many of these do get out of the house and would not meet the strict Hikikomori definition, but their lives are still restricted by the problem. I think it's useful to have these criteria, as I said, if only so that we can research the problem effectively. Do we need people to see themselves as mentally ill? No. As a matter of fact, I think that's a detriment and a barrier to improvement. A great number of people with this problem are anxious and depressed, and they see those feelings as signs of a mental illness. What they miss is that excessive social isolation and dependence on others and a lack of engagement with the world is a great way to become more anxious and depressed. Most people, if given the life of a Hikikomori, would feel as depressed and anxious as they do. Their mood issues often are not a sign of mental illness. Quite the opposite. They're a sign of normality. And we don't need to medicate them away or suppress them. If I hit my thumb with a hammer, it hurts. That doesn't mean I have a thumb disorder. It means I have a normal thumb. If I restrict my life and become a shut-in, there are predictable emotional consequences that are not a product of pathology, but of being human. The criteria are useful to define a group of people so that we can try to understand what's going on, but they're not in the standard manual of mental disorders. And my bias is that they not be included in the next revision. There are other videos on this channel on the subject of failure to launch or delayed transition to adulthood or Hikikomori, and some of those concern the young adults themselves and some of them concern parenting issues. Click the subscribe button for more. For parents who find themselves in this situation, I also have an online course, The Parent Trap, available from my education site here. For young adults who find themselves in this situation, you might benefit from my book, How to Be Miserable in Your 20s, 40 Strategies to Fail at Adulting. And that's available from all online booksellers. Thank you for watching.